everyone. Welcome to the week of April 13th for LIB 151. Today we're going to be talking about information privilege and the digital divide. So I want you to take a moment and think about, what does the digital divide make you think of? What images come to mind? What have you heard about the digital divide? Because you may discover that what research shows about the digital divide doesn't always line up with the reality of what we think about it. So when we talk about the phrase the digital divide, we're usually referring to the differences and disparities between access to devices, access to high-speed internet, sometimes called broadband internet, but also the use of those devices and the use of internet. We see those divides among racial lines, gender, location within the United States, education level, and pretty much any distinction you can think of where there are historically disadvantaged users. Most prominently is the difference between rural Americans and those in urban or suburban locations. All of LA County, for the most part, falls into this urban or suburban designation. However, as you saw in the reading for this week, there are many other users where that's not the case. This chart that you're looking at comes from Pew Research Center, and it's based on the most recent research available for the digital divide in 2019. So you'll notice for home broadband, only 63% of rural Americans have access to internet at home that's at a high enough speed to, stream a Netflix movie, telecommute, work from home, something like that. And that's a pretty big distinction between urban and suburban locations. Same thing with smartphones, tablets, and desktop or laptop computers. There's still a pretty big divide between suburban, urban, and rural areas. Now, the FCC will, the Federal Communications will map these different broadband areas, and you will have read about this in the research for today. And so, for example, we can look at a particular address or explore a location. So let's just zoom in a little bit on California and what area, how many broadband providers there are and what they are. So you can see LA County pretty well saturated, a lot of dark blue. This is an area where users have a lot of choice, presumably have something that is widely available to them. Let's look at some place perhaps like Lancaster area, a more rural location. And you can see that, for example, this particular census area in Lancaster, the only internet that's available tends to be from satellite locations. This is very common in rural areas. And one thing about satellite internet, if you've never had the joy of having it, is that it's subject to weather issues. So for example, when I lived in Duluth, Minnesota, snowy locales, if it's snowing, you don't get internet if you're on satellite. And same thing, some of these are not fast enough to be considered high speed. So this Frontier, VSAT satellite and telecom is not considered fast enough to be high speed. We're left with these two satellite providers. The other thing you'll have learned in the article is that just because somebody in the census block can get internet from Hughes doesn't mean every single person within this area can. So I'm sure we've maybe all lived at or know somebody who has an internet service that we can't get at our own house just because of what's available there. I would encourage you to explore the map here from the FCC. It's pretty interesting to see some of those areas. You can see some of the lighter patches are areas where there is virtually no providers as well. There might just be one provider. So I mentioned before when I lived in Duluth, Minnesota, and I worked at University of Wisconsin-Superior, a lot of the students that I worked with or served lived out in these rural areas, the lighter blue, where there was only satellite internet. It was very unreliable. So we were pretty used to having to do things analog and not being able to expect folks to have internet at home. And this is true for a lot of the country outside of the LA community. Let me go back to those slides. So that's the link if you want to go check it out. You can also find it just by Googling FCC broadband map. It's mentioned quite a bit in the reading and wanted to give you the opportunity to look at it. One thing to note about broadband and FCC is that the FCC has previously overreported the number of Americans with access to broadband. So in the article you mentioned, it said that, only 20-ish million were without broadband. However, independent reporting that's happened since those articles were written found that it's a lot closer to 42 million, if not more, and that the way that they initially defined broadband wasn't actually fast enough. Additionally, the census, which we're in census taking time right now, if you've received a census form at your house, definitely fill it out. The census data is used for all kinds of things. We often talk about it being used for federal funding or for how many representatives we have in our government, but it also helps determine these tiny things like which areas the FCC is going to work to connect. We saw that data we looked at was sorted by census tract. Some other facts about the digital divide, also from Pew Research, is I don't know if you're feeling this right now, I know I am, the homework gap. That's because 1/3 of households with school-aged children who are lower income, so these are families that make less than $30,000 a year, don't have access to internet at home. You can see that if you make quite a bit more, then that's usually not a problem. So students who are lower income just don't have access to be able to do their homework at home. This other chart from a report that you're seeing on the right indicates how often teens in high school, based on race and then based on income, have to do their homework on their cell phone. And you can see that for less than 30K, it's pretty high having to do homework on a cell phone. I don't know if you've tried to access Blackboard on your cell phone or type a Microsoft Word document, but many of schools' resources are not always mobile friendly, and it can be difficult to type something very complex on a phone for sure. And then 1/4 of households who make less than 30K a year don't have access to a computer at home. Now compare this to it's about 1 in 12 for those families that make over $75,000 a year. So it's a pretty big gap between the two. This doesn't just affect children in high school, though. We also see that lower income Americans have just lower levels of technology adoption as well. So in this particular chart, we're seeing the percentage of US adults in 2019 based on income who have access to the following devices. And again, take a look at that home broadband chart. This is high-speed internet at home. Where the gap is starkest is with those multi-devices as well. So, we might have 71% of lower income Americans have access to a smartphone, but have access to a smartphone and something else, or all of the above, very tiny percentage. In addition to these gaps that we see based on race and location, there is also 10% of Americans who just don't use the internet. This doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have access to it. They are just choosing, either because they don't have access or not, to not use the internet. This has declined quite a bit, but even as recent as 2015, 15% of Americans weren't using the internet at all, which I found to be pretty surprising. When Pew Research Center has surveyed these folks, they are mostly over the age of 65, but not exclusively, and they mostly are lower educated, including not having a high school diploma. About 60% of them do not. However, that's not across the board. When they ask folks why they don't use the internet, there is some perception amongst older adults that they're too old to learn. There are some people who said, there's nothing for me to do on the internet. I have no interest in it. And then, of course, cost is also a factor in terms of non-use. And not to be a super downer, but I think we're all seeing aspects of the digital divide in this very moment that we're living through. I'm trying to do kindergarten classwork with my daughter through Google Classrooms on her Chromebook, and it is very difficult and not necessarily ideal. And we were lucky enough to have had a Chromebook for her. Many other students just in LAUSD don't have access to those materials. They were having to get them through their schools. There was a huge delay. I don't know if you've read any of the reporting about that or have siblings experiencing that yourself. On March 31st, the LA Times reported that over 15,000 high school students just were absent online. They haven't done any schoolwork since March 16th, when everything was canceled, because presumably don't have a device, don't have a safe area to do work. It can be really hard. And so when we talk about the digital divide, we're talking about those people in particular. I also thought this chart right below from the New York Times was pretty interesting because we've become very reliant during this time of crisis on services that allow us to learn and work from home. You can see Zoom, Google Classroom, Hangouts, everything is sort of skyrocketing. And so if you don't have access to one of these particular resources, you're really being sort of left out there. And then I've mentioned this before, but I'm a UC Santa Cruz alum, go Banana Slugs. And if you didn't know, the UC grad students have been organizing a strike for a while to strike for a living wage for their teaching assistants. And many of the universities, including Dominguez Hills, have put out surveys to their students, like what can you do to help support you in this time as we move online. And there are some really interesting responses that different UC grad striking organizations are tweeting. So this is one that I saw that I thought was interesting and relevant and speaks to the digital divide. This student is somebody who currently lives in their car because they can't afford anywhere near UCLA. They need to use Zoom, which doesn't work very well from a phone. You need an internet connection, and that the free internet specials that the school was sending out only work for new customers. And the apartment complex or the trailer park where they are moving is not considered a new customer because somebody else has had internet before. I know that happened to me when I lived in Santa Cruz and I was, going from apartment to apartment, and student housing is none of those deals really worked for you because a previous tenant in the apartment had internet. So all of these things, this digital divide and information issues that we saw with open access, where some people have access and some people don't, both of these can be considered forms of information privilege. This definition actually comes to you from Wikipedia. It's pretty good. I may have edited this Wikipedia page at some point in time too. But information privilege is the idea that access to information is based on an individual's status of some kind. So this might be access to technology. It might be an aspect of your identity related to race or gender. And this is creating a power dynamic where we have people who are sort of haves and have-nots when it comes to information privilege. So I want you to think about all the things you could not do successfully without devices and without access to internet. So for example, that might be applying for a job, using a fillable PDF, for example, that you have to turn in. It might be accessing a doctor remotely through telemedicine, very important right now. It might be schoolwork. It might be actually doing your job remotely. I know I don't have a mouse at home, which is just killing my wrist, which is so tiny, not an aspect of information privilege, but I can't imagine if I didn't have access to a laptop, for example. So what can we do about this? Well, of course, like anything, we can advocate to elected officials to make, for example, the internet a public utility, or to support the efforts of the FCC Digital Divide initiatives. They have quite a few digital divide initiatives going. The article that you read today talks about one that funding has been extended, so up to I think $20 billion or something like that, to further extend broadband access across the country. And then also in the article, you may have noticed that some of the folks are using libraries to access internet. For many people without internet at home, libraries and other sort of public places are areas where people can access internet for free without having to purchase something. I thought it was pretty ironic in this recent pandemic that libraries, which are frequently underfunded and often have our budgets cut year after year after year, many of us weren't allowed to close because we were seen sort of as a public good that needed to stay open to provide folks computers and internet. We were initially on the floor as being essential. And then just like we've talked about before, to support open access publishing, we learned about that in previous weeks. And then for those of us who are, in positions, maybe at your workplaces or after you graduate college, to also think about analog alternatives for that 10% of people who don't have access reliably to the internet. For example, things like the census or tax forms or other important avenues for us to just live our lives are almost exclusively online now. So how do you bring people in who don't reliably have access to those technologies?